Joining me for the holiday, NBC's Kelly O'Donnell covering the president down in Florida. Danya Perry here with me, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. Mac McClarty, former White House chief of staff to President Clinton, and MSNBC legal analyst Glenn Kirshner. I'm very fortunate to have such an auspicious panel with me on this holiday. Kelly, let's start with where the president is. If he is sweating over impeachment, he's doing a decent job of not showing it. At least the narrative from the White House has been pretty clear as we enter this next phase of hearings, right?
Well, and we were at the president's rally in Florida here, where he was able to vent and get some of that impeachment frustration off his chest, surrounded by 20,000 supporters in Sunrise, Florida. That was Tuesday night, sort of get into the holiday mood for the president, if I can use that sort of characterization, where he was able to talk about his frustration with Democrats. There were a couple of expletives included as well. The president pushing back hard on all of this. And one of the arguments he makes now, Chris, is he believes that over time, and while lawmakers are in their home districts and states for the holiday, that they may be hearing from constituents who do not support impeachment. Certainly many Democrats are from districts that are solidly blue and therefore likely to have a strong support for moving forward with the impeachment of the president. Still some question about how many Americans want removal, but Democrats certainly believe they have laid out their case. The president is hoping that especially in those districts where he performed well, but perhaps a Democrat was elected in 2018, that there could be some pushback that might give some Democrats pause. And he touts the fact that the Republicans have largely been unified in not believing that whatever occurred on the matters of Ukraine, that it does not rise to an impeachable offense. So that's a lot of what we've been hearing for the president, who gets to mix a little sunshine and golf with his concerns about impeachment as well, as he's got some family time over the next several days.
So,
Chris?
Mac, you understand better than almost anybody how a White House navigates political pressure. Do you think, as you watch that this White House, that this president is resigned to impeachment, but heck, they feel 100% confident about the Senate, so now they can focus on how to galvanize those voters in 2020 and in fact, use impeachment to galvanize them?
Well, I think, Chris, first of all, happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving, my friend.
In terms of the White House, you know, my best thought, certainly the way President Clinton conducted his presidency during the impeachment. I was not still in the White House, but he clearly compartmentalized and separated impeachment and stuck to the people's business. That's what I have suggested. More importantly, Speaker Gingrich has said that publicly, as has Senator Graham. That is not the course that President Trump is following, and therefore the White House is following right behind him. I think, you know, there's some feeling that they still have kind of a standoff here in terms of the Congress with the Senate, but that's pretty fragile, Chris, in my opinion.
So, Glenn, in the middle of all this impeachment stuff and all the political ramifications of it, there's this new report on Rudy Giuliani. He quickly tweeted a denial saying it's fake news. He did not pursue a business opportunity in Ukraine, although documents that were obtained by the newspaper suggest something different. So if you were his attorney, do you try to convince him to stop tweeting? What would you say to him?
Yeah, not talking anymore would be good advice to Rudy. And, you know, real quick, if we break this down just kind of on an ethics 101 basis, Chris, you know, if Rudy Giuliani is going to Ukraine and interviewing a potential witness on behalf of his client, Donald Trump, if he is also involved in discussions with that witness, Lutsenko, and trying to potentially strike a business deal with him, I have to tell you, that's really world-class unethical conduct for a lawyer because...
Well, let me ask you, and I'm sorry I'm interrupting you at the because, but unethical, illegal, something that the bar could look at? I mean, help me to understand what we're talking about here.
So all of the above, Chris. Here's why. Because if you're representing a client and you're dealing with a witness who could have information that could assist the client, everything that you do with that client becomes important and will be looked at under a microscope. And if with that same witness you're trying to strike a business deal, it makes suspect any information that witness provides. A quick analogy is when I was a prosecutor, if I bought a witness a cup of coffee, for goodness sakes, I had to disclose that to the defense attorney in the case. Why? Because
Literally
that's
a cup
me.
of coffee?
Literally. Now, that's worth about $4 these days from Starbucks. I recognize that. But because that is me potentially giving the witness a benefit. I know it sounds crazy, Chris, but that $4 benefit could become relevant in the information the witness was presenting to me. So the defense attorney at the end of the day would get to cross-examine the witness about the fact that I gave him a $4 cup of coffee, and might that have impacted the nature of the information the witness presented. On a larger scale, that's what we're dealing with when Rudy Giuliani is talking about $200,000 and $300,000 business relationships with a witness in a case that he is investigating.
That's a lot of cups of coffee. So, Danya Perry, we know a couple of individuals in Giuliani's orbit, Lev Parnas, Igor Fruman. They're in some legal trouble. The campaign finance charges against them already filed. But there's this broader ongoing investigation. How do you think SDNY is going to push all of this forward?
Well, look, there's a playbook in the Southern District, and the prosecutors are proceeding exactly along the lines that you would expect. This is an extraordinary case in many ways, but it's also, you know, it follows exactly what you would expect. And so they're following the money, they're following the leads, where it takes them. And as we've now heard, they are now pursuing an investigation against Rudy Giuliani.
Yeah, so every time you go down one area, it may take you in another direction. These are complicated stories, right?
It's complicated in some ways, and of course there's many different directions, there's many tentacles, but they are clearly pursuing one of those lines against Rudy Giuliani, and they have now expanded this investigation to include his finances, his business dealings, perhaps campaign contributions that he was associated with. And so they are zeroing in on him. It's very clear. And, you know, he's responding with these tweets and these public statements that, you know, as Glenn said, is just ill-advised.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's probably a reason why it was difficult for him to find a white-collar attorney to represent him, because he believes he can represent himself. In this case, that's probably poor judgment.
Yeah, I mean, he hasn't been charged with anything. He denies it. Nevertheless, what we know about this investigation shows us exactly what you said. And then, Glenn, there's yet another new issue for the White House. And I want to play, just to sort of set this up, some of what we heard from Gordon Sondland this past week about a key conversation he had with President Trump.
I believe I just asked him an open-ended question, Mr. Chairman. What do you want from Ukraine? I keep hearing all these different ideas and theories and this and that. What do you want? And it was a very short, abrupt conversation. He was not in a good mood. And he just said, I want nothing. I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. Tell Zelensky to do the right thing. Something to that effect.
This has been a key talking point for the president, Glenn, for his supporters. I said clearly no quid pro quo, but now the Washington Post is reporting there aren't any documents to corroborate the description of that call or even records in the White House call logs. It just muddles this all up even further.
Yeah, you know, the fact that President Trump announced that he didn't commit the crime after he was caught committing the crime is not all that persuasive, phone records supporting it or not. What we know is the most important record that tells all of us what President Trump wanted from President Zelensky is the call summary, where he said, I want you to do me a favor, though, look into the Bidens, I'm paraphrasing there, and get with my lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, which further undercuts the president's claim that we heard more recently that I have no idea what Rudy Giuliani was doing in the Ukraine. Everything else should melt away as a sideshow, Chris. We've got the call summary.
You know, people, Mac, are getting exhausted by this. And you talked about the time when President Clinton, and he famously was able to compartmentalize things when he was going through his impeachment. And he and Newt Gingrich, frankly, at the time were able to do deals even through the course of impeachment. But we obviously are in a very, very different time here. As you look at it through that political lens and 2020 and the exhaustion factor, do both sides, with impeachment, with this back and forth, with all of these investigations ongoing, have some real risk here with the voters?
Chris, I think you summed it up perfectly. I have been saying, trying to make those points. I mean, the real issue here is people are exhausted and they're concerned, they're unsettled, they're uneasy. And they want their government in Washington, their elected officials, starting in the White House, but going to the Senate and the Congress, to be concerned about their needs and try to lift them and their families and address these issues. We've got a lot of issues out there and opportunities. Got real big issues on trade, obviously a lot of international issues, some security issues, some economic issues. I remain deeply concerned about the deficit. And when you mentioned Speaker Gingrich and President Clinton, they were able to work together and balance the budget and move toward a surplus. That's what people are concerned about and focused on, and all of this is a risk to both parties, exactly as you said it, in my opinion. Well,
Mac, you teed me up perfectly for what I want to ask Kelly about before we go. You talked about trade, you talked about the economy. There was this critical decision we were waiting for from President Trump, and he signed legislation from Congress supporting Hong Kong's pro-democracy protest movement. And he, of course, is in these tense negotiations with the Chinese on trade. There were questions about what he would do here. Tell us about this decision and what it means going forward.
Well, Chris, it took a while for the president to add his signature to these two bills that were overwhelmingly passed by Congress. But he did do that last night, and it sends a signal to China at a time when the president, we know for months, has been trying to get President Xi and the different negotiating teams from the U.S. and China to come to terms on trade. And so it was a position where the president is standing up for the democracy movement in Hong Kong, but doing it at some cost. His concern about his relationship with China. And already China predictably responded by recalling their own ambassador, by also reaching out to the U.S. ambassador, Terry Branstad, who's a close ally of the president, to complain about this. And basically what lawmakers had decided was that the U.S. would be able to review periodically how the U.S. government interfaces with Hong Kong, which has autonomy even though it belongs to China, to make certain that there would still be protections for democracy there. So the president did what was expected, but at the same time, the response has been expected, and the potential cost is still a question mark. Will it affect his desire to have a trade agreement with China? Chris?
Kelly O'Donnell, Danya Perry, Mac McClarty, Glenn Kirshner, I am so appreciative of you spending part of your holiday morning with us, and happy Thanksgiving. Thanks so much.